if you've ever tried to like sell a house or sell a car or some item online, you put that item out there, and particularly like in the case of a house, you collect multiple bids, right, and you take the best. And everybody understands that intuitively as making 100% sense, right? Like, of course, you would get multiple bids and take the highest. And surprisingly to many people, the advertising industry didn't work that way.
Yeah.
Instead, you kind of had this, you said, well, I think it's worth $100, and the first person to offer you 100 or better gets it. And the third person, could have a better offer. And so the way that we called that the waterfall, and a request would come into the top, and basically the first acceptable bid would win. And we know kind of in game theory and auction logic, that's not the optimal result. And so Prebid creates what they call a fair auction, which is just all the bids coming in at once and the best one being selected.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the eMarketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm super excited to have Stephen Johnston on today. Stephen is the founder and CTO of Pubwise, and probably not everybody's familiar with Pubwise. So why don't we start with the elevator pitch for Pubwise and the origin story?
Sure. So, in simple terms, Pubwise helps publishers or anyone who sells digital advertising through programmatic make more money. And I mean, that's the simple pitch. Expanding that out a little bit, we have built a programmatic advertising platform based on Prebid that allows a publisher to very simply deploy this modern programmatic advertising technology, really in the same way they deploy any other kind of JavaScript library. And so instead of working with a developer and going through development cycles to get things released, they put our script in the page and then they manage it, either utilizing our services or managing it themselves just through a point and click UI. And so if you're familiar with Google Ad Manager or even like the AdSense backend, it's that kind of UI for Prebid. And so cycle times are improved, the number of people required to man it is reduced, and that sort of thing. And we have a patented technology that optimizes Prebid for who's participating in the auctions as well as who is not, and then how are they configured. And so our publishers go from using a small set of bidders to on like maybe all of their auctions, or from having 2 or 3 different configs to thousands of worldwide configurations where they actually expand the number of participants. So the result is better win rates and more revenue, but there is a benefit to the buy side as well, because they see less waste and they see less impressions that they're not interested in.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And if my memory serves me correctly, the whole concept of Prebid was sort of eliminating these dual sales channels where, there was internal guaranteed inventory, and then there was obviously real-time bidded inventory. And the idea was, well, sometimes there was a particular signal in an impression where it would have been far more valuable to sell it in a real-time environment, but due to the weird early plumbing of the internet, the guaranteed impression took that slot and made the publisher less money. And so that idea of Prebid and it happening in the header was sort of like this idea, like, wait a minute, let's try to add efficiency to the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
And,
there's an analogy I use that I think a lot of people kind of have some connection to. If you've ever tried to like sell a house or sell a car or some item online, you put that item out there, and particularly like in the case of a house, you collect multiple bids, right, and you take the best. And everybody understands that intuitively as making 100% sense, right? Like, of course, you would get multiple bids and take the highest. And surprisingly to many people, the advertising industry didn't work that way. Instead, you kind of had this, you said, well, I think it's worth $100, and the first person to offer you 100 or better gets it. And the third person, could have a better offer. And so the way that we called that the waterfall, and a request would come into the top, and basically the first acceptable bid would win. And we know, kind of in game theory and auction logic, that's not the optimal result. And so Prebid creates what they call a fair auction, which is just all the bids coming in at once and the best one being selected. And yes, there's a lot of complexity and some nuance, but that's really the goal.
Which, using your house analogy, you had me think of the one other factor, which is very common in when thinking about the pre-bid plumbing, which is, well, what if like 2 minutes after I accept an offer, another offer would have come in, and that has to do with like, where's the cutoff, right?
Yeah.
Of course, in the case of pre-bid, it's milliseconds, right?
Yeah,
We're operating. You're waiting
Yeah.
a certain amount of time for the bids to come in, and then you have, at a certain point, you have to say, listen, it's it. I gotta serve something. I gotta take it. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's funny that we're sort of trading those kind of things, right? So before you had some ability to decide like kind of how far down the waterfall you were going to allow things to flow, but only up to your minimum bid. And so the average time, because of the dynamics, might be 500 milliseconds. And so as we move to pre-bid, you say, well, I'm going to close the auction at 500 milliseconds, but I'm going to get multiples. And so there is a bit of a give and take. I think people don't always understand that, when you think of the best case, the auction happened faster in the waterfall, right? If that, in terms of getting a suboptimal offer, it happened faster. But the optimal offer was out a little bit of time. And so exactly that, there's this window opened up, and give us all your bids. And so timing becomes critical. Everything being fast becomes even more critical. The plus side is now we're in the browser, and this is happening in the browser. So it's closer to where it's in the end going to be delivered.
So how do things change in mobile environments where there are SDKs and it's not a standard browser? Are the implications of that different, or are they pretty similar?
They're similar in terms of creating the fair auction. How that gets executed does change. There is kind of more outside the device activity. There's a server component that kind of architecturally looks a little bit more like a traditional kind of offer or bid setup, except that now there's a fair auction going on inside of it.
Right. Fascinating stuff for sure.
Yeah.
The one thing that I've noticed in the last several years is there were acronyms that were come up with a long time ago with regards to SSPs and DSPs and exchanges. And in the last 5 years in particular, the lines have gotten pretty blurry, right? You've got DSPs that end up with direct connections to certain publishers. You've got SSPs that allow advertisers to come in and buy directly on the SSP. And so how do you see that all shaking out? I mean, are the acronyms even necessarily appropriate in the current ecosystem, or is there really just sort of this removal of layers that's happening?
I think all of those things are kind of live right now. And I think there is something of an industry evolution happening. Legislation like GDPR and California legislation, and now Canada, and everybody else is getting into this privacy, and that's driving some of it. But the tech under the hood has evolved some. The ability to transact has gotten more standardized, is open RTB and things like industry standards out of the IAB, and more companies talk this kind of common language. And it makes sense to me that they would remove intermediaries, right? It's a common progression in industry to say, if I have to go through 5 people to sell this, then can I remove 1, 2, 3, or 5? And so I think this evolution is natural. I think, we often talk about we're working with X company in an SSP capacity, like knowing that they may have a DSP side of their business. How are we interacting with them so that we can at least kind of draw a circle around the nature of our business together, because those lines are blurred. And so the classic audience out here, publisher, SSP, exchange, DSP, marketer or agency, and then like brand, that very clear like set of boxes is just gone.
Right.
And I think when you see things like Google's post-cookie kind of thing or cookie deprecation, the APIs they're coming out with, I think a lot of that squeeze is being felt at the SSP layer. They're really having to prove their value. And you see them saying, okay, well, we're going to jump the DSP directly to a brand, right? Because, those values essentially are proven by removing the 15 to 20% that each of those layers takes out of a transaction. And both sides kind of feel that pain. If 20% is taken out here, there's less working media from the buy side, and then there's less revenue from the sell side. So if a company can remove one of those hops and then kind of share that as more working media on one side and more revenue on the other, then everybody benefits. And so that's the game that's being played.
Yeah. And to your earlier point, it would seem like that also removes latency, right? And you said speed is key. Right.
Yeah.
So you get that with improved speed if you remove a layer, and greater monetization, which we could decide, how that gets split. It's sort of like, removing an extra broker for the real estate transaction, right? Who ends up with the win?
Yep. Yeah. And so then that turns into all of these other metrics in the page. Like, we know about viewability and, that user experience as people move between transitions and pages, and are they really seeing the ad? Do they have an opportunity to click it because the behavioral aspects of the user are in the right state? The faster you can get those things done, all those things benefit.
Yeah, so. For sure. So one other thing that was fascinating to me is people don't realize that every impression, they sort of assume every impression is looked at by everybody. Right, because of the way the plumbing sometimes hooked together, right, and either a DSP not deciding not to bid, or just being late in getting to the party after the doors closed, right? There are situations where you may want to be potentially buying through different channels, but then as things have moved to a first party auction pricing model, things get sort of complicated. So. How does that impact monetization if, a few demand partners get an opportunity to bid? Do you get like 95% of the value just by, closing the doors to the party early, or how does that end up shaking out?
Yeah, I think in our experience, the answer to that question is going to depend on a lot of variability. And so there isn't kind of one answer. There's a series of kind of things that you look at. And so you can look at how long is an auction open, and we get a little bit of data that comes in like after the auction's closed. We do get to sort of see a potential future, right? Like, or an alternate reality, if you will. And then kind of measure that. And so, we run analysis on, had that auction been open another 10 milliseconds or 50 or 100, what would the results be? And so that can give us things like basically like revenue capture calculations. You're capturing 96% of your opportunity inside of this. Now, if you open that window up further, you might capture more revenue, but does it decrease other metrics that would be deleterious to long-term results? So sometimes opening that window can have a short-term result of more revenue like in the moment, but if it impacts viewability, then the actual long-term performance and the results to the buy side now you start to look like a poorer performer, and so that increase in revenue can drift away. And and so in our experience, you've got to constantly be monitoring this. And I think a lot of people on both the buy and the sell side, it's like they they task a person to measure something, get an answer, and then they think there's just one answer, and they're not always coming back and remeasuring. And that's limitations of human effort and resources and all of this. But these things really do change, and like you change one thing and another thing modifies. And so, in terms of the impressions coming through, we've got a lot of efforts around things like ads.text, which is an effort to allow a publisher to declare who can buy their inventory and who they're working with directly. And that allows the ecosystem to see if a request comes through and then it's not really through a channel that's authorized, to assume that they're not really authorized to buy it. And so they can improve those purchasing paths. It's called supply path optimization. And I think at least part of the answer to your question of why does everybody not see a request is that a lot of these things are going to so many different places that from the publisher's perspective, the seller's perspective, they probably do have a pretty good sense that all of them are seen. Now, as that goes down the channel and gets all the way to the buyer, if you're only buying over here, then that may not be the reality. If that's just your one path, then that may not be the reality, even though the publisher is out there saying, the seller's out there saying, man, I'm getting a lot of offers. It's yours that isn't coming through. And so there absolutely is a play in multiple pools, play in multiple paths. That problem isn't solved. The idea that there's just one golden path through the inventory, I think it's nice. It's a nice idea. I think that if companies are providing value along the way, you're always going to have variability in some amount of performance. Someone's either got better audience enrichment or faster handling, but that can also be faster handling today, this hour. They can have their own budgetary considerations inside of it. So it definitely makes sense to kind of buy through multiple channels because the sellers are selling through multiple channels. Everyone's measuring that and determining that multiple channels make sense. So it's just an unsolved problem that there's a golden path. Yeah. And I don't think if the industry is innovating, there'll ever be just one path on either side. There won't ever be one path to a buyer and one path to a seller.
Right. That's a great point. Well, I'm sure that you and your team focus a lot on trying to understand what the primary factors are that drive efficiency and yield, while also maintaining transparency. And you've got this a lot of the data augmentation layer potentially will go away to some extent, depending on where the whole identifier ecosystem shakes out. Right? It used to be that you could augment data around an impression and get a whole lot of information, and some of that may be less easy in the future. So have you guys sort of managed to figure out sort of what the primary factors are outside of that drive efficiency and yield?
Sure. From an algorithmic perspective where we sit, we focus heavily on interest. And typically our proxy for interest is bidding of non-zero values. And this is going to get a little kind of nerdy, but we're primarily a sell-side optimization platform, and we absolutely have positive impact on the buy side because we can open up inventory to different channels that a publisher wouldn't typically find. But to us, there's this whole sea of technology around regulation, identity graphs, identity resolution, attribution, measurement, all of these things that measure like campaign performance. And for us, what we're trying to do is measure their signals that they see value in the inventory, which is primarily, are they bidding? And from there, are they bidding well, fast? There's all these other secondary things, and when, and all these kind of dimensions of it that we use to measure. And so our goal as a platform is to let these other companies figure those things out and let them really provide value there. and then for us to just make sure the right participants involved at the right time.
Yeah,
And,
that's an amazing point, right? Because the bid is essentially the amalgamation of everything that they all know, plus
yeah,
potentially some winner's curse dynamics of stuff they don't know, but they're willing to take a
yeah.
guess.
Yeah, it's you know, in sort of mathematical terms, it's an integral function, right? Like it integrates all of this knowledge that's in the world into,
Right.
we have an interest in this. And I don't necessarily, as a platform, have to know why.
Right.
What I do is I run test sets across the industry to figure out when are you interested? How are you interested? If we make this change, does it change that interest? And then we can add this second layer of, okay, if we tweak this, does your interest increase? If we tweak, but you know, we first have to determine just the binary, any interest at all.
Right.
And so, I mean, but you look more broadly to answer the question, what can a publisher then do to ensure that they're sending out the good signal? And I think this is the same kind of thing for buyers. If you know things about your audience, you should be working really hard right now to find ways to communicate that. And the cookie has been relied on. And you know, to be clear, the cookie is this identifier, right? It really just stores a number, let's say. And in some other system somewhere, that number is associated with information. And everybody kind of behind the scenes reconnects these numbers together so that they get the identity graph and all these kinds of things. The publishers and sellers and buyers have kind of been relying on this sort of high fructose corn syrup version of it, right? It's real sweet. It's kind of easy. It's cheap. It works. But it isn't maybe very nutritional. It has sort of flaws, right? And you know, frankly, it allowed people to kind of be, you know, I don't want to say lazy. I mean, it allowed people to use that as a crutch. It was kind of going on behind the scenes, and it was easy to activate, and we're just well out of that world. And you know, buyers need to understand that there's going to be some shakeup in how those identities get surfaced, and the sellers have to be surfacing the right data so that when both sides get smart about what they want and how it gets connected from a technical perspective, everybody's in the right position to do it. Otherwise, we'll end up in this sort of lag, and we'll end up in, you know, and I do fear there's going to be this period of kind of a dark ages where there's plenty of budget. Some of the tech isn't connecting audiences to interest. And, you know, there's a period where there's going to be less fidelity in saying, you know, the scale basically of a campaign comes down. And that's a real risk if everybody doesn't take it seriously and start to surface the data they do have and start to express the interest in that connection from the buy side.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
that dovetails perfectly into my next question, which is you mentioned about on your website that you want to deliver high performance to both the publisher and the advertiser, and that radical observability is sort of the key to that, right? So,
yeah.
And I see observability as sort of having the sister of transparency, right?
Yeah.
This idea that the more you know, and if it's accurate, right? Because obviously there are publishers who may be spoofing certain information or exaggerating certain information. And, you know, it's interesting to see all the things that they try to pass through that may not be entirely accurate, whether it's a category, you know, or whether it's a lat long in mobile, right? Where you think they may be lying about where the person is, right?
Yeah.
So you know, I'd love you to think to talk about the radical observability construct and how it's good for everybody.
Yeah, our industry started talking about transparency a while back, and transparency. And I think transparency is awesome, right? But transparency can be the presentation of data without context. Mm-hmm. And you can provide a lot of data and say you're transparent in metrics that don't provide enough information for either side of the transaction to optimize. And, it's transparent to just say we bought X and the qualities of X was, these 3 dimensions and we bought a bunch of it. But I think the reason we focused on observability was observability has a meaning, and it's data that allows you to understand the inner behavior of a complex system, or in really any system, but in our case, a complex system. So we want to provide observability. We want to provide that data and push the industry to provide the data that's necessary for everyone to properly optimize. There has been an adversarial relationship with people who provide the seller and fraud, right? And so some of this lack of observability and even lack of transparency is, well, we provide you enough information to know exactly why we're interested in it. You'll just fake it. And then everything will look like it's really good and we'll buy it. And the industry has to get better at measurement. Everybody has to get better understanding of non-campaign, non-ad campaign metrics that prove results, right? And so you can't just say, well, we delivered 10,000 impressions to a auto interested buyer and therefore this campaign is successful. It's like something in that campaign during the time that it's running has to result in some non-campaign metric you can measure. And then those other things that we talked about can kick in, like SPO, and say, well, we have this site in our group, and they didn't add anything to it, and these non-campaign metrics didn't improve. So maybe we turn that off because they are providing us, bad signal or bad audience. I think it's tough. I think it's a real tough problem. I think that we're seeing human and some other companies that do fraud detection are moving closer to the publisher. They've been in this Prebid capacity for a long time and using Prebid in a different way than Prebid.org in the library. But just before a company bids, what kind of decision can you make? And they are able to do some things like deploy their own script to verify Prebid how this comes. So there is a layer where you can say, well, the seller said that this was LA, but the request is really coming from Morocco, and so or that this is an LA fashion interesting person. It's really coming from Morocco, and their profile is completely different. They're interested in something else, and so it's like that. There may be a buyer for that, there may be a buyer for this, but when you misrepresent it, the whole thing just gets blown up. And so more parties involved in at least that first hop is what's going to be necessary. It's an incredibly hard problem, and I think that the landscape around legislation and privacy does not improve it, and it improves it in the sense that that for the consumer they have more privacy. So I'm not arguing against that. But as you push more responsibility to the sell side, it opens up new windows of misrepresentation. So I know it's kind of a long, rambling answer to say it's tough.
Yeah, for sure.
Really tough. For us, we want to partner with providers who are going to take that bid off the page and validate it in some way, and then work with sellers who are open to that analysis. And so there's a simple kind of gating question. If we deploy a tool like Human that's going to validate your inventory, are you okay with that? And, if they're not, then we probably shouldn't be doing business with them.
Right.
And so, that's part of where the SSP has traditionally played a role, right? It's kind of being that gate and saying, we're going to build this relationship with publishers. We're going to have the conversation about quality. We're going to have the conversation about tools and techniques to ensure it and validate it. And then you can just buy from us, and hopefully we've done that well. And I think So that responsibility is going to push more to platforms like ours, where we're doing the optimization in the page. We're working directly with the publisher even prior to the SSP. So we as a company are asking, what can we do in the page to validate? What can we deploy that doesn't impact latency, that'll get us answers about what is the nature of that audience that then we can validate. And but there's a responsibility on the buy side for those non-campaign metrics.
For sure.
To put those together and say, we're getting quality inventory, we think, and more measurement, more validation is going to be necessary.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to ask about the impact to monetization of identity graph, getting a little bit more fuzzy as a result of third-party cookie deprecation. But of course, within a bunch of browsers, they're already gone, and they've been gone for a long time.
Yeah.
But I did read something interesting, and maybe it was actually pretty scary, but I think that there was a proposal that another version of Chrome in the future would also obfuscate IP address. And if that happens, it seems like checking for humanity and checking for location and like a lot of the things that the ecosystem relies on in order to not only be transparent but observable would break, right? Except if one large entity who shall remain nameless just decides like, well, I'm the only one who gets to have that information.
Yeah, and there is you've hit on two like big topics here. So
Yeah.
Let me sort of like deconstruct that a little bit in terms of impact on monetization. In the near term, all these changes around identity is going to be a decrease in scale, uncertainty around the specificity of that audience, which is like kind of the fraud question. But I think it's also just uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
So we've got things, and this is kind of like the second part of your question. There are companies coming out and saying that they're going to do things like predictive audience and like predict. So if you have a predictive audience, you by extension have a predictive attribution, right? You have predictive measurement.
Yeah.
And there's some statistical games to play where like inside of a privacy sandbox or inside of like a privacy box, things, and then what you communicate outside of that box is obfuscated in a statistical way, but not a so that you can't like extract an identity out of it, but that for the population it's accurate. Mm-hmm. So there are, I don't want to say math games, there's tricks. There's tricks where you can obfuscate identity while still allowing enough resolution of the population's makeup. And but that to me from the sell side and the buy side just means there's a whole lot of questions around, are these things working? And then like we've already talked a little bit, there's this an opening for an increase in fraud. Those three things are kind of the three things programmatic advertising has dealt with in different degrees forever. And so so as the industry innovates, we always deal with different versions of these. Right? A new type of inventory comes out, it opens up fraud until we learn to deploy something to measurement. What the difference here is we're getting a government entity coming in and saying you need to do these things, and we're getting more like consumer pressure from a privacy perspective. And so instead of just innovating on technology, there's this external pressure. It feels different, but these are the problems that the industry has solved for decades now. And so I feel positive about it, but uncertainty is really the key right now.
Yeah. The other thing that some people are focused on is the overall sort of systemic overhead, right? To the extent that it's not a very green from a carbon footprint perspective idea. And I'd love to understand to what extent maybe session level persistence or other elements around that can maybe solve for that, right? So if I'm on because some websites get one impression and that's it, right? And so obviously now from that perspective, a bidding decision is made once because they were only there once. But if I'm going to consume, 15 pages worth of impressions on a website, does each decision need to be made in a silo? And is there something around sessioning that can sort of improve efficiency there? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, like, do you feel like the industry is doing a pretty good job thinking that through? And are there headwinds coming from browser changes or cookie changes that are actually countermanding, ideas around efficiency from a greenhouse gas or carbon footprint perspective?
Yeah. So like Google's new proposal for their post cookie is called Pappy. It involves a whole bunch of new requests out of the browser and here and there. And so everybody's got questions about, well, what's the impact of those? Are they additive, or are they really just a request doesn't happen over here and now happens over here? So there's a lot of questions around that. I mean, our focus as a company has been to find the bidders that are interested. Business has to get done. And
Right.
so, the only site that doesn't produce any carbon impact is one that you just turn off. And so business has to get done. We've all got to eat. And so our focus is on finding those interested buyers and presenting them the inventory they're interested in and reducing the waste. So a platform like ours, we can reduce total bid volume for a seller by as much as 40% and either retain or improve revenue. We look at that as that's the straight 40% reduction in whatever the impact of all of those wasted requests is.
Right.
And so there are opportunities to make changes like that we feel are very impactful, and they're early in the cycle of waste. They just don't even enter the system. You don't have to ask, like, what should the machine learning process be run on this bid we didn't even get? Right? It's not even, you don't even have to ask that. Like, what was the power consumed for requests we never even received? There's a whole other group of people that are focused on, once that request leaves the page, goes into the ecosystem, do we need to do things like determine whether certain vendors should be involved because they're going to have some impact? Do we need 3 measurement vendors? Do we need 2 other data vendors who do analysis? And then people ask, well, what kind of machine learning analysis do you have to do in order to determine all those things? And then what's its impact? And so there gets to be this a little bit of snake eating its tail kind of question as you go around. I think the industry's paying attention to it. The industry wants to know how they get compensated for it, and there's buyers who are interested in inventory that has certain qualities around sustainability. I think the industry's approach very much right now is kind of like product packaging in your grocery store. You've got 2 products, and one says non-GMO, non-GMO, no wheat, no gluten, and this and that, and the other one doesn't. And some people gravitate to that and want to buy that, and they're willing to pay a premium. That's kind of where the industry is right now. The industry has been working on, what does that wording mean? What does non-GMO mean for advertising? What does no gluten mean for advertising? And so there's certainly a lot of debate. There's a company, Scope 3, who's trying to get some of that through modeling. There's the IAB and some marketing groups that are trying to come up with what are just the big picture items that contribute. Because you can add up a whole bunch of things that in the end are like a rounding error in the total impact. Right. And so they're working through what is really the most impactful. I would say, we work on the publisher side, and publishers are definitely feeling like a lot of this conversation becomes about requests out of the page. And, we think we improve that, but the industry keeps coming back to the publisher, and it's like, reduce your requests or reduce your this. And they feel like there's a little bit of a cram down. Mm-hmm. Where they're asked about requests when there's massive ads that come through that maybe like get loaded in the browser but then don't play. Mm-hmm. So like, to me, the carbon question has to be, every time that ad fails to load, but you know that the video at least came in your browser, that has a massive carbon impact. And it's like 100 times the request that went out to, and I just mean massive in terms of the transaction, right? Like massive percentage.
Comparatively speaking,
Comparatively speaking. And so, there's responsibility all around. And I think we're starting to see a little bit more of a holistic focus, and we'll see. I mean, it's a big question. There's market value all around. There's real value. There's technical opportunity. It's an interesting question, but the solution is still, 100 different companies vying to be the solution.
It's not completely baked yet. So what has you excited about the next year? I'm sure you've got stuff in the product roadmap. Obviously, there's then bigger picture things that might also be exciting. So love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think I think I'm interested in the uncertainty around attribution and measurement and the kinds of problems that we've talked about here that are hard. Those interest me. And as a company, I'm excited about our role in allowing publishers to navigate that, because we're really a measurement tool. We aren't a tool that solves the problem of identity resolution. We're not a company that solves the problem of carbon. We're helping our publisher partners determine who is solving those problems to their benefit and to the buyer's benefit. And so that uncertainty is exciting, because it's where we get to show our value. And we've had a lot of companies come out in the last couple of years saying they have solutions for this, but the cookie hasn't actually gone away in a significant enough inventory to really prove it. So we've got this phase where the companies that are really in the ecosystem providing value, the rubber's going to meet the road on that. And I think that's super exciting. I think, the generative AI thing is interesting. We deal primarily with machine learning and kind of a softer AI than that. But I think there's a lot of opportunity around presenting data in more interesting ways and in ways that makes more people in an organization understand them. And I think the combination of these two is going to be interesting. We've got this complex way to describe the identity, determine the identity. We've got more complex sets of data. Can we build systems that better explain that to humans? So there's a kind of a confluence of things. So that's what interests me. Uncertainty is opportunity, and I'm excited about it. So
no shortage of uncertainty at the moment. So
yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Stephen, for joining me and educating me on this plumbing that we all rely on every day, but don't really get to see. So that was really great.
Sure thing. I appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate you having me on.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in the Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.